Open a gardening book published before 1950, and a peculiar ingredient shows up again and again in the margins, in the handwritten notes, in the small practical asides experienced growers used to pass down without much ceremony. Onion skins. Steeped in water, poured at the base of struggling plants. It appears in farm journals. It appears in extension pamphlets from land-grant universities written for rural households. It appears in the kind of advice columns newspapers used to run for home gardeners, sandwiched between recipes and weather predictions. And then, sometime in the decades following the Second World War, it simply stops appearing. Not because anyone disproved it, not because a study came out showing it failed. It disappears from mainstream gardening advice for the same reason a long list of free, effective, kitchen-based remedies disappeared during that same stretch of decades. The economics of the lawn and garden industry changed, and what could not be sold stopped being talked about. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains something that puzzles a lot of long-time gardeners who grew up hearing fragments of this kind of advice from a parent or grandparent. Advice that never quite made it into the glossy magazines or the garden center displays of their adult lives. The period right after 1945 saw an extraordinary expansion of the synthetic fertilizer and pesticide industry in the United States. Factories that had spent the war years producing ammonium nitrate for munitions pivoted almost overnight to producing it for agricultural fertilizer. The infrastructure already existed. The chemistry already existed. What was needed was a market, and building that market meant convincing several generations of American gardeners and farmers that the inherited knowledge their own families had used for free was outdated, unscientific, and best replaced by something purchased in a branded bag. Some of that shift was genuinely beneficial. Synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, derived from the Haber-Bosch process developed decades earlier, prevented real and serious famines and fed a rapidly growing global population. That part of the story deserves honesty, not dismissal. But alongside the genuine benefit came a quieter casualty. An entire body of low-cost, kitchen-based, biologically sound gardening knowledge got pushed to the margins, not because it had been tested and found wanting, but because nobody could put a logo on it and sell it at a markup. Onion skin tea is a near-perfect example of why this happened, because the economics of it are almost embarrassingly simple to understand once they are laid out plainly. A company that wants to sell a garden product needs several things to make the business work. It needs an ingredient that can be sourced in bulk and concentrated. It needs a manufacturing process that can be patented or at least kept proprietary long enough to justify a premium price. It needs packaging that can carry a brand identity onto a store shelf. And it needs a margin wide enough to pay for the advertising that gets the product in front of customers in the first place. An onion skin satisfies none of these requirements. It cannot be patented because it is simply the outer layer of a vegetable that has existed in roughly its current form for thousands of years. It cannot be meaningfully concentrated into something dramatically more valuable than the raw material, because the active compounds are already present at useful levels in the dry skin itself. It has no packaging story, because the product is, quite literally, kitchen waste. And it requires no advertising budget, because there is no profit margin to fund one. This is not a conspiracy in the sense of secret meetings and hidden documents. It is a far more mundane and, in some ways, more troubling story. An entire category of effective, free remedies simply could not compete for attention in a media landscape funded by advertising, because the companies funding garden magazines, manufacturer-sponsored extension materials, and eventually television gardening programs had no commercial interest in mentioning an alternative that cost nothing. The knowledge did not disappear because someone hid it. It disappeared because there was no profit motive driving anyone to keep repeating it, while there was a very large and growing profit motive driving constant repetition of the branded alternative. Here is what that branded alternative typically claims to deliver, and here is what the forgotten onion skin remedy was already doing for free. Quercetin, a flavonoid compound found in concentrated amounts in the dry outer skin of an onion, has been studied extensively in human nutrition research for its antioxidant properties, the same properties that get marketed in supplement bottles selling for $20 to $30 a bottle at health food stores. Inside a plant, quercetin functions differently, but along a related theme. It contributes to the plant's defense against environmental stress, including UV exposure and certain fungal pathogens. And it plays a role in the broader category of plant secondary metabolites that support what researchers call induced systemic resistance, a plant's own internal defense response that activates ahead of an actual infection. Alongside quercetin, the dry, papery skin of an onion carries meaningfully concentrated potassium, along with measurable calcium, magnesium, and iron, locked inside fibers that, left dry and intact, release almost nothing useful to a struggling plant. This is the detail most modern references on this topic get backward, and it is worth correcting clearly. Burying dry onion skins directly into garden soil, the way many casual gardening tips suggest, does technically work, but it works on a timeline of weeks, sometimes longer, as the fibers slowly break down. A plant in active distress, yellowing leaves, stalled growth, the early signs of fungal pressure during a wet summer, does not have weeks to wait for slow decomposition to release what it needs. The method that actually produces fast, usable results is extraction through water, not decomposition through soil contact. The principle is the same one behind making tea from any dried plant material. Water pulls soluble compounds out of dry plant tissue far faster than soil microbes can break down that same tissue physically. A handful of dry, papery onion skins, the kind that accumulate in a kitchen drawer or a small jar kept specifically for this purpose, goes into a quart-sized glass jar filled with cool tap water. No heating required, no specialized equipment. Left at room temperature, the water begins changing color within hours. By the end of the first day, it has taken on the shade of weak tea. By the second day, it has deepened into a clear, rich amber, roughly the color of black tea steeped a few minutes too long. That color change is the visible signal that potassium, calcium, magnesium, and quercetin have left the dry fiber and entered the liquid in dissolved, plant-ready form. 24 to 48 hours is the complete extraction window. There is no benefit to steeping longer, and unlike fermented preparations, there is no risk of spoilage developing within this short time frame at room temperature, since the process here is simple extraction rather than fermentation. Once the liquid reaches that deep amber color, it is ready to use, undiluted, poured directly at the base of the plant rather than on the leaves. This is a meaningful difference from several other kitchen-based garden preparations that require careful dilution before application. Onion skin tea, prepared through cool water extraction rather than fermentation, does not carry the concentrated organic acids that make undiluted fermented brews risky to tender root tissue. It can go straight from the jar to the soil at full strength. Applied at the base of a yellowing tomato plant or a pepper that has stopped setting fruit, the visible response typically begins within days rather than weeks. Stems begin to thicken first, often within 3 to 4 days. New leaf growth coming in noticeably greener follows shortly after. Flower production on stressed plants frequently picks up within the first week of consistent application, applied roughly every 7 to 10 days throughout a fungal pressure-prone stretch of the season. The mistake most first-time users make with this preparation is impatience in the wrong direction, the opposite problem from most fermented kitchen remedies. Because the process here is simple extraction rather than fermentation, there is a temptation to assume hot water might speed things along, the same logic someone might apply when making a cup of tea. This is the single detail worth correcting clearly. Hot water extracts certain compounds faster, but it also begins breaking down some of the more delicate flavonoid structures, including a portion of the quercetin content, before that liquid ever reaches the garden. Cool or room temperature water, given the full 24 to 48-hour window, extracts a more complete and more stable nutrient profile than a rushed hot water version ever will. Patience with temperature, not patience with time, is the principle that matters here. The dry skins removed from a finished batch can go directly into a compost pile, where whatever trace nutrients remain will continue contributing slowly to that longer-term process. Nothing about this preparation generates waste. Even what comes out of the jar at the end has a second purpose waiting for it. There is a particular kind of clarity that arrives when looking at this method next to the products it has been quietly competing against for the better part of a century, without anyone ever framing it as competition. A bottle of quercetin supplement, marketed for human health, sits on a shelf for $20 to $30, sourced largely from the exact same plant family this method already uses, processed through methods designed to justify that price point rather than to outperform what cool water and patience accomplish for free. A branded foliar fungicide, promising to support plant immune response during fungal pressure season, sits on a different shelf, often built around compounds that work through a related induced resistance mechanism, priced according to what the packaging and the advertising required, rather than what the underlying chemistry actually costs to produce. Neither of those products is dishonest about what it does. The chemistry behind them is generally sound. What neither of them mentions, because mentioning it would undermine the entire premise of the purchase, is that a comparable mechanism has been sitting in kitchen trash for as long as kitchens have existed, available to anyone willing to spend 2 days and a quart jar instead of $20 and a trip to the store. This is not a story about a single villain or a hidden cover-up. It is a story about what happens to free, effective knowledge inside a media and retail ecosystem built on advertising revenue and profit margins. The knowledge that survives and gets repeated generation after generation tends to be the knowledge someone has a financial incentive to keep repeating. The knowledge that quietly fades from gardening columns and extension pamphlets tends to be the knowledge nobody profits from mentioning, regardless of how well it actually works. Onion skin tea is one small, specific example of that larger pattern, preserved mostly in the handwritten margins of old books and the half-remembered habits of gardeners who learned it from someone else, before the advertising-funded version of gardening advice became the only version most people ever encountered. For anyone standing in a kitchen tonight about to drop another onion skin into the trash, the alternative costs nothing and takes 2 days. A quart jar, cool water, a handful of dry, papery skins, and patience measured in hours rather than weeks. The amber liquid that results does, for free, a meaningful portion of what a $20 supplement bottle and a branded fungicide spray are both built around selling separately. If this kind of honest, historically grounded gardening knowledge is what brought you to Rooted Grace, the like button and the subscribe bell keep this work going every week. Drop a comment below if a parent or grandparent ever mentioned something like this to you in passing, something that never quite made sense until later in life. I would genuinely like to know how many of these fragments are still floating around in family memory, waiting to be understood. The next video in this series goes into a related kitchen extraction method, one that addresses a soil deficiency almost as overlooked as this one, using an ingredient that has survived in folk gardening advice for an even stranger reason. That one is coming next week. Until then, save the skins, fill the jar, and give the water 2 days to do what it has always known how to do.